In the text we are studying, Sri Aurobindo is leading us to the recognition of how this supramental principle is already embedded in the instincts of the mind. And therefore he says, as life has emerged from matter, and as mind has emerged from life, therefore supermind must emerge from mind. There is one law from the lowest to the highest. And he describes how, in the domain of matter, we already see the instinct of life embedded, and he describes the characteristics, vibrations, actions and reactions, attractions and repulsions, contractions and expansions, tendencies of combination, formation and growth, seekings and responses. And it is only when all these can organize themselves sufficiently to be able to express more and more directly that we say that the visible principle of life has emerged. In the same way, he says, life also is instinct with the stuff of mind, abounds with an unconscious sensation, will, intelligence. But the visible principle of mind can only emerge when the necessary vital conditions have been prepared, which will permit it to organize itself in living matter. And the same logic now he applies to mind, where he says, mind too is instinct with the stuff of supermind. But the visible principle of supermind can only emerge when the necessary mental conditions are prepared, which will permit it to organize itself in man, the mental living creature. And it describes what are the instincts of supermind in mind. In our study last time, we looked at the first two. But before we continue with the list in a deeper study, it's useful to review something common across these three levels. Everywhere he uses this language where he says, the visible principle of life can only emerge when. The visible principle of mind can only emerge when. And then again, the visible principle of supermind can only emerge when the conditions are prepared. And this suggests a deep truth that this emergence is not happening merely by a pressure from below. That is something inside mind, something inside matter which is pushing out life, although that also is true. But there is equally the principle of life which is working for itself and by itself. Although embedded in matter, it has its own sense of purpose, its own sense of mission. So if we draw the analogy which is there before in his language of the birth, that nature is preparing a birth in the same way as matter gave birth to life and life gave birth to mind. So in the birth there are two elements. There is the body of the mother who forms the substance of the child out of herself and yet gives to it an impetus, a push, which eventually involves even a throwing out to complete the separation. But there is at the same time the consciousness of the child which enters this now fetus and develops its own sense of form, its own sense of purpose, influencing the formation of the body with its own needs. And when finally the time comes to emerge, it decides often. It participates in the emergence. And there is a kind of an exchange. The consciousness in the child informs the consciousness of the mother's body when it is ready to leave and triggers, kickstarts the process. And a similar idea is here implied in the language, that life force itself, although embedded in matter, is struggling to emerge and find its own expression free from matter. But because it can never be fully free, it is so deeply embedded, it forms its expression in and out of matter. But there is a transition point where it struggles to separate from its material womb, even as matter itself is instinctively pushing. But where is the source of the instinct of matter? What is it in matter that compels it to form the necessary conditions for life to emerge? Deep within the instinct of matter, deep within the life force itself within matter, there is the mind, and within the mind there is the supermind, and in it is the divine will. The divine will secret within matter through so many layers of influencing influences which influence subsequently. So many layers of indirection, it forms and pushes out. But because of the layers of indirection, the process is slow, laborious, long, across billions of years, they say, in our study of science. But the next step, the emergence of mind out of life, takes place much faster. Because there within the instinct of life are only two layers, or perhaps just one layer. Behind the layer of life and mind instincts within life is the supermind working through the mind instinct, which works subsequently through the life instinct to push forward mind. And therefore, the layers being less, the action being less indirect, the process can take place much faster, more rapid, more direct, more obvious. And the next step, therefore, of the emergence of supermind from within mind will be even faster. Because mind now already is a domain which is conscious of itself. And although within it are the instincts of supermind, still indirect, secret, working within the mask of mental processes, behind that is the power of the divine will in the supermind pushing. And mind itself, because it is capable of becoming conscious, self-aware, can become conscious of its own inner potentiality, can consciously participate in its discovery. It is only covered, you only have to uncover. And can participate in its formation and organization of the possibilities of the supermind principle being organized within mind. The animal cannot learn to quiet itself in order to help the mind emerge. But the human mind can train itself to become silent in order for something deeper and higher to emerge, express itself, and even organize itself. And therefore, this last step can happen rapidly. Instead of billions of years of the material evolution, instead of millions of years of the life evolution, instead of thousands of years of mental evolution, the whole thing can be attained in a single lifetime, in principle. And we have seen the example of this in the example of the great rishis of the Veda, who realized and expressed the consciousness of the supermind. We have seen that example even more profoundly expressed and developed in the forms of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, where not only they embodied the supramental consciousness, but organized it even in the physical consciousness, something which was never done before in the history of the universe. And therefore now we can say, if these examples have already set the precedent, if they have already forged the way for the expression of this consciousness, the time is ripe for humanity to realize and to complete this final step. In the way Sri Aurobindo describes it, mind too is instinct with the stuff of supermind. And he lists sympathies, unities, intuitions, emergences of pre-existing knowledge, instincts, imperative lights and movements, inherent self-effectivities of will, which disguise themselves in a mental form. So 7 things. But each of these disguise themselves in a mental form, and therefore they may even appear to be, to us, mental processes which are unusual. They may even seem as if processes which involve some kind of material cause and logical step. But in fact, when we observe these for what they are, when we go deep enough into these instincts or experiences, we find they always bypass material sources and logic. We saw last time what the sense of sympathies is, the capacity innate to us to feel what others feel, to resonate in emotion, even in experience, to receive from others, to transmit to others experiences. And although we may use words to make the point of contact, the thing itself can never be fully expressed through the word, and the word is only a temporary link through which we experience a transmission directly of the sympathies. And the same with unities. We saw the example of how the mind contacting another mind in concentration connects to catch directly the idea. But there is a point of unification of consciousness, however brief, however minute, through which the actual transmission of the idea takes place. Both of these would come under the general broad category of oneness of consciousness. You will notice that all these which he has described could be placed in 3 broad categories: oneness of consciousness, completeness of knowledge, and effectivity of will. These 3 are characteristic of supermind. Supermind is a consciousness of unity. It is the oneness of the divine that prepares to manifest multiplicity. It is the one consciousness which knows the oneness indivisible and the multiplicity of extreme division and can hold both. And therefore, the increasing organization and expression of the supermind in humanity is characterized by a unification, a bringing together into oneness, into unity, even while in the midst of diversity. The result of the supramental manifestation in 1956 is that in spite of political differences, in spite of interests which want to keep humanity divided, fighting, and in enslavement, we have come together. Today's humanity thinks in global terms. Unlike the humanity 40 years ago, which thought in its local interests and looked at things of the globe as far away. As a result of this pressure also, the processes of human life organization have been compelled together in depth of entanglement that if something happens in one corner of the world, its ripples are felt across the earth. Economies are intertwined. Legal systems have got interdependent. The media is now international, and so on. And finally, the pressure of the supermind has organized in humanity the necessary means for this unity to be expressed, again in spite of interests which want to divide. And one of the most significant vehicles for this expression is what we call today the internet. The mother foresaw this mechanism because it was inevitable, whether in this form or another. And in the 1950s, she described how, in the future, she said, they will find a way to connect money transaction at the point of transaction to one central place. And rather than physical money being exchanged, it would just be a number which would be changed in that central place. They would find a way to connect. If you think of the mindset of humanity in those days, the experience of radio was something extraordinary. To think that they would find a way to connect every transaction taking place, whether in your home or in the most ordinary shop, to some central place on earth where it would somehow get added or subtracted from an account, was inconceivable. It was almost like in the domain of magic. But today, because of the internet, we have our mobile phone, we wave it on a device to make a payment, we have cards, we wave to make a payment. Where does the actual transaction take place? We even have a vocabulary for it. We call it the cloud. Where is the cloud? We don't know. We don't care. It's vague, non-material. Somewhere out there, somewhere it is happening. So the abstraction of this center of the world is also one of the aspects of the internet. It is oneness present everywhere, and yet allowing for differences, linking the differences and unities. So just as in the material organization, the supermind has had to create means to bring together into unity, exactly the same process has to take place within our mind. To organize its expression, it needs to bring this capacity to express oneness directly. And so this is the first category, sympathies and unities. The second category is the second characteristic of supermind, because it is, in a sense, we will say, the mind of God which conceives the universe. That is supermind. It holds all the knowledge of the divine, both the oneness of knowledge and its multiplicity, and all possibilities, infinite potential of its multiplicities, and draws out of them certain aspects, sequences them, arranges them in perfect relation to each other. And therefore it is the consciousness of omniscience, all knowledge of the divine. And you see the next few, intuitions, emergences of pre-existent knowledge, instincts, are clearly all knowledge aspects. And the last two, one of them borders knowledge and will, and the last is distinctly will. It is imperative lights and movements, inherent self-effectivities of will. So the imperative lights and movements is straddling both knowledge and will, and the last, effectivities of will, inherent. These two would come in the third category of the will, because the supermind is also, we might describe it as the will of the divine to manifest. It is the station where all knowledge, omniscience, is one with the power of knowledge to express, without opposition, perfectly, in the minutest detail, because all is already held in conception, from the grand plan to the minutest details. And it moves. What is known is the will, what is willed is the knowledge. There is no difference between knowledge and will. And so it is not only the mind of God, but the will of God equally. Omnipotence is the third characteristic. So you see these three categories here clearly formed. We have touched upon sympathies and unities, and now we touch upon intuitions. Intuitions are, okay, so that was one unity. Now we begin the category of knowledge with intuitions. Intuitions are movements of the mind where we know by passing logical steps. When life places before us a challenge, our mind struggles to understand, to make sense, to organize the understanding by catching pieces of facts, of information. What it can get from outside is one, and then it turns in and draws what it can get from inside, from my past memories. Where else have I seen this situation? How did I apply possibilities then? What worked, what didn't work? And the new knowledge from outside and the past knowledge from inside are brought together in one mix. Even that is not enough. And so we go deeper into the past knowledge, not just of myself, but of the collective knowledge and experience of humanity. There was a time when you had to go to the library and go through an index card to pull out a book and turn through pages of the book looking for a simple solution. And if you had the wrong book, you would still waste days. Today you type a few keywords on the internet and there is a spontaneous, instantaneous access taking place across all the body of knowledge which has been accumulated there. And the answer comes in milliseconds across the earth. The actual server which did the search might be sitting on the other side of the earth, diametrically, but from the point I hit the button search, it comes within a few milliseconds. My request goes across the earth, scans through all the existing knowledge organized on the internet, and instantly reaches me. Physically, it's the closest we have to omniscience. And this is a vehicle organized by the supermind. But the same process seems as if to happen in our mind when we tap into some kind of a knowledge, looking for an answer, and suddenly we know, and we're not sure how. We assume it was because our mind sifted through layers and layers of past knowledge, put together certain pieces of connections which I had not explicitly thought out. This links with that, that links with the other, and so the things just fall into place and pop, I know. The actual process of cognition is hidden. In the same way as on the internet, the actual process of the search is hidden from you completely. You hit search, it pops up, and that's it. But the internet has gone through a process. It has searched through a mechanism. And we therefore assume something like that happens in our mind. With the appearance of computers, it became very easy for us to assume that the brain is like a computer, meaning it also follows mechanical, systematic, sequential, or even parallel orders, rules, patterns, commands. Before the computer, we always thought that there's something magical about the way the mind works and the brain works. But after the computer, it was easy to reduce it. But still we find, as we try to make the computer approach these capacities of the mind, we cannot. And so a whole field of artificial intelligence develops. But still, what makes that intelligence reach these peaks, we do not know, we cannot describe, therefore we cannot replicate on a computer. In fact, we realize very often when the intuition kicks in, that it is contrary to the existing facts. The facts given to you may give an appearance, but the intuition says, this is wrong, something else is going to happen, something else is correct. He is lying. And I don't know how, but I just feel it in my gut, I say. And then we realize that the intuition is something quite different. And these intuitions pop up as if imitating processes of the mind, but they are not. They seem to imitate because the actual entry of the intuition takes place in a part of the mind which is behind, concealed from the surface, self-aware activity of mind. And then from there it emerges through exactly the same passages through which the subliminal thinking process emerges. Because the pattern of emergence, the point of emergence is similar, we conflate the two. We identify and confuse the two. But if we become very quiet, we will notice that a true intuition has a very different feel. It comes spontaneously, but it has as if an experience of a light, a dawning, something awakened, something revealed, something discovered or uncovered, and with it even a touch of joy, a sense of discovery of something new. And there are such distinctive feelings which are not part of the normal, mechanical, even if subliminal functions of the mind. So intuitions are our first sign of formations of the supramental knowledge within us. Second, he says, emergences of pre-existent knowledge. And this is something much harder to distinguish. We have knowledge which was already there before. And so we can assume that this knowledge somehow was gained when I was a child, I must have read something, I must have heard something, and therefore it must have come to me. But I have forgotten what it was, the source, from where I got it. But I know it. It's as if the knowledge was already there. But there are cases where this explanation does not hold. A child at the age of 3 speaks in a foreign language which is unknown to the parents, unknown to the environment, even what language it is. We do not know. We call a linguistic expert who then says, this is a special variation, a special dialect of Chinese spoken in such and such a part of China. And this is in a child born in Ukraine. They've never heard Chinese in that whole family, not even through the internet or the radio. And yet this child speaks fluently in that language. This is a real case which we know of. And so we cannot explain these kinds of pre-existent knowledge except to say that something is transmitted from a previous life. Variations to this would involve childhood geniuses who seem to have spontaneously capacities and skills which were never formally taught. This child simply sits on the piano and starts playing skillfully pieces of music which he hears once and he can transcribe instantly, composing things which have harmonies which even his brain is not sufficiently developed to express. So there is something which was already held within which comes forward. But something like that can also happen in the adult mind in one of the forms in which the intuition expresses itself. We, although never trained in a certain activity, we can enter the activity, become very quiet in the mind, in the emotions, and in the nerves, in the body substance, and then allow the inspiration to fill and to act. And then we find almost spontaneously, effortlessly, we are able to do with skill that which we never trained for. There will be variations to this which involve specifically knowledge. And then it would not seem too different from intuitions. But the difference would be this, that while an intuition is felt as something which has just come in, this emergence of pre-existent knowledge is felt as something which was always known but which had been forgotten and which now I remembered. Although I do not remember when I knew it or how I knew it. But the emergence has a familiarity as if you're remembering. In the synthesis of yoga, Sri Aurobindo describes how the mind makes a transition from the mind of ignorance to the mind of knowledge. And in between, the passage is the intermediate mind, which is the mind of self-forgetful knowledge. And this is when something of the intuitive consciousness has sufficiently organized itself, and we realize that whatever we come to know corresponds to something we already knew. And later, we need only turn within and discover what we already knew, as if it was always inside us, but we had forgotten. And it is in this form that there is the emergence of pre-existent knowledge. Third, instincts. So, if we had to divide these three, intuitions would be more obviously in the mind. Emergence of pre-existent knowledge can be something which can be mental, emotional, or even a sensory. And the instinct is of a lower order, where you have the urge, the will pushing you, but you do not know why. You do not know for what. You just know it's the right thing to do, and you do it. Or sometimes it does itself even without your knowing it. I mentioned on other occasions of how people were trained by the US military for remote viewing. And because the method of training involved tapping into the body consciousness, the body was allowed to move instinctively and follow its feeling. Therefore, most of these people developed a very refined sense of access to intuition through the instinctive feel. And one of the remote viewers narrates how he was driving on the highway at very high speed, and at some point there seemed to be a blockage somewhere, some accident seemed to have happened. And as he was looking quite distractedly in that direction, suddenly his feet pressed on the accelerator and his hand turned violently and turned the wheel at high speed on the highway, and the car turned and crashed to one side against a pillar. And he was in a shock. What happened with my body? But even as he turned and crashed in that direction, behind him there was a huge truck which cut right through where he was. Had he gone on in the normal direction, the truck would have smashed into his car. He would not have survived. As it happened, something in the body consciousness kicked in, did exactly what was needed, faster than one could think, faster than the mind or brain could process the knowledge and take a decision. And it saved his life. So we find instincts within us which have precise knowledge, the kind of which would take the conscious mind a long process to even come to as a conclusion. But the instinct acts instantly. I have often taken this example when, for example, you have a pin prick on your finger suddenly. The finger instinctively pulls back. If you consider the intelligence involved in that decision and movement, you cannot explain it purely in terms of brain, neural circuitry, and the nervous system. So the instinct itself happened faster than the signal could reach the brain and an order go from the brain. So obviously the brain was not the processor. The processing took place in the hand. At best the signal could go all the way to the spine. But even there, when it happens, you touch something very sharp or hot, there's no time for that. So within the hand and the nervous system within the finger, there is sufficient intelligence not only to make out that the prick is dangerous, but to be able to map out in which direction the prick is pushing, in which direction the fingertip should move to get free of it, which muscles need to be bent in what sequence to be able to make that exact spatial movement. If the same thing had to be programmed in a robot, it would involve a computer which is dedicated, working to make all the calculations necessary. But this happens with just a few nerve cells which are not even supposed to be organized to express intelligence. So the power of the instinctive knowledge is so great, we cannot explain it in terms of normal mental processes. Intuitions, emergences of pre-existent knowledge, instincts. So instinct, already there is knowledge, and there is the action of knowledge, which comes instinctively, impulsively. And this prepares the transition for the next, imperative lights and movements. So here he brings knowledge and actions together. Lights, you have a revelation, and a movement and expression. When I read this line, I felt impelled to take a particular example. It is an unusual example, perhaps involving a long explanation, but it is an interesting example for many reasons, as you will see. Imperative lights and movements, where knowledge and movement are as if impelled, forced upon us, willed into us, in a way that, not as an instinct, as a reaction, which happens on some level, but as a sustained push, compelling our thoughts, feelings, or actions. This sometimes happens when an idea comes to your mind, and it keeps nudging you, pushing you, prodding you, until either you express it or act on it. I'll still come to the main example shortly, but before that, a few other examples. Once Udarda narrated how a woman from Europe had come. She was looking for some spiritual guru who will help her to recover her falling hair. Her problem was that she was losing hair rapidly and she didn't want to lose it. She wanted some miraculous magical intervention by someone in India who had the magical knowledge or power. And somehow she ended up coming to Pondicherry. He was the intermediary for the point of contact. By the time she came to the ashram gate, she was so shocked by the poverty and the dirt of her journey that she was in no mood to step down from her vehicle. And sitting on her vehicle, she said to Udar that I cannot stay here, I have to go, I am too disturbed by all this. And Udar felt a very strong urge to tell her these words: it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich woman to enter the gates of heaven. And when the urge came so strongly, he thought it very strange. Of course, the wording is from the biblical tradition, from the Bible itself, slightly modified for a rich woman. But he held it back somehow. She left, and then he came to inform the mother that this is what happened. And when he mentioned these words, the mother said, "Oh, why didn't you speak? I had put those words in you. And had you spoken those words, it might have changed her life." But an imperative like this, which involves a light, a kind of a knowledge, and then a movement, a will, a tendency to push, to act, to express and materialize. So the example which I had was drawn to take was unusual. It is a poem written by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, very famous poet. He wrote it in 1797, published 19 years later. And the poem is called Kubla Khan. Some of you who have been through English literary studies would know of it. He received this poem in a dream, opiated dream state. So because for some medical reasons he had to take opium, and he was for 3 hours in a state of dream which was not full sleep but seemed to be a trance-like state. Just before sliding into trance, he had read a sentence from some writing of some travelogue of Xanadu, which is a place created by Kubla Khan, palace. And with that, his eyes closed, he went into this state. And during those 3 hours, it was as if he received an inspiration forming a poem which went up to almost 300 lines, all of which were fully fresh in his mind when he emerged from this dream state. So he wrote the poem and he puts as a subtitle, Kubla Khan, or A Vision in a Dream, to highlight the fact that it was not just a poem which came in, but he experienced something which translated into a poem. And then as he got up, he took a paper and pen and started writing. And I think he wrote in all about 54 lines, which he could recall. In fact, less than 54, when somebody knocked at the door, and the person took 1 full hour of his time, and by the time he comes back, he's forgotten most of it, and the last few fragments that he could recall, he wrote. And so you have about 54 lines only. And however much he tried to recall, he could not get the rest. He did not publish it because of the unusual circumstances and it being incomplete. Later, under pressure from a friend, he did publish 19 years later. After he died, critics have considered this one of his 3 best poems. Now, the character of this, why I took this example, there was this element of an imperative light, a knowledge experience which was compelled on him imperatively. He could not choose. He did not have the ability to refuse. It was pushed into him. And then from there, the movement to write it, to give it form, was also imperative. He had to do it. And if not for the interruption which broke the flow, the stream of that imperative, he would have completed something extraordinary. Now, this background, this example first, can be best understood when we look at the background of the man himself. As many of these great poets, Sri Aurobindo observes, were also mystics, and that's why they were great poets. So I came across some interesting description. First of all, he himself has a kind of an introduction to the poem, and he writes it in third person, introducing the poem. I skipped the first para. He writes in his own words, "The author continued for about 3 hours in a profound sleep, at least of the external senses," that is, sleep of the external senses, "during which time he has the most vivid confidence that he could not have composed less than from 200 to 300 lines. If that indeed can be called composition, in which all the images rose up before him as things, with a parallel production of the correspondent expression, without any sensation or consciousness of effort." You see, the whole description is of a state which is exactly what we are studying, imperative light and movement. Something is compelled on him, and what is compelled, he says, images rose up before him as things. They were living, vivid, real images, but with a parallel production of the correspondent expressions. So the experience comes as a thing, and at the same time there is the formulation of the expression in the rhyme, rhythm and meter of the poetry. And there is no sensation or conscious effort. It's just happening, unfolding, revealing and flowing. So the aspect of experience, knowledge, and the aspect of expression, both are happening simultaneously, parallelly. On awakening, he appeared to himself to have a distinct recollection of the whole, which is also surprising. 300 poems, 300 lines composed like this, and you come out and you have a recollection of the whole. So it's obviously not a normal memory. It is held in a kind of a deeper, experiential, intuitive memory even. And that's action, that's working right now, in action. And taking his pen, ink and paper, instantly and eagerly wrote down the lines that are here preserved in that book. At this moment, he was unfortunately called out by a person on business from Porlock and detained by him above an hour. And on his return to his room, found, to his no small surprise and mortification, that though he still retained some vague and dim recollection of the general purport of the vision, yet, with the exception of some 8 or 10 scattered lines and images, all the rest had passed away, like the images on the surface of a stream into which a stone had been cast. But alas, without the after restoration of the latter. So even the way he describes, you can see how the whole experience was of an intuitive consciousness. The image forms on the water of a stream when it is still. You throw a stone and immediately it's broken up. That's the experience he had of all those image experiences being as if broken up, scattered. But in the water, when it becomes quiet, the image reforms, and he says that sort of thing didn't happen to him. And then he has a poem describing how this restoration takes place. And I read that just because you will get the sense of the whole experience. Then all the charm is broken, all that phantom world so fair vanishes, and 1,000 circlets spread. That is when the stone falls. And each misshape the other. Stay a while, poor youth, who scarcely darest lift thine eyes. The stream will soon renew its smoothness. Soon the visions will return. And lo, he stays. And soon the fragments dim of lovely forms come trembling back, unite, and now once more the pool becomes a mirror. So he's describing the state of his mind, that scattered condition and then the coming back. It becomes a mirror to something else, something higher. Then he continues writing the description in the introduction. Yet from the still surviving recollections in his mind, the author has frequently purposed to finish for himself what had been originally, as it were, given to him. But the tomorrow is yet to come. So this very distinctly, then he continues. As a contrast to this vision, I have annexed a fragment of a very different character, describing with equal fidelity the dream of pain and disease. So you can see the qualitative difference of inspiration. But he says very clearly he has the sense that this was given to him. It was not his creation. There's another portion where he describes, in response to this poem, describing this poem and his experience of it, he writes to someone what he felt. And it's fascinating, and it will give you a deep insight into not only him, but the poets of that period. His feelings related to those expressed in the poem. He writes, I should much wish, like the Indian Vishnu. Okay, he is familiar with the Puranic traditions. I should much wish, like the Indian Vishnu, to float about along an infinite ocean, cradled in the flower of the lotus, and wake once in 1,000,000 years for a few minutes, just to know I was going to sleep 1,000,000 years more. And then he says, why? Why does he want that? I can at times feel strong the beauties you describe in themselves and for themselves. But more frequently, all things appear little. So he's describing now 2 levels of experience. The beauties of the higher domains of consciousness, which he at times can feel. And more frequently in the normal consciousness, all things appear little. All the knowledge that can be acquired, child's play, the universe itself. But what an immense heap of little things. My mind feels as if it ached to behold and know something great, And these are his emphasis, little, great. My mind feels as if it ached to behold and know something great, something one and indivisible. And it is only in the faith of this that rocks or waterfalls, mountains or caverns give me the sense of sublimity or majesty. Now you see the yearning deep within him. He feels his mind is aching, not just to know but to behold, to stand before and experience in a vivid experience. Something great, something one and indivisible. And it is against this faith that he finds everything else to be sublime and majestic. So you see here something of the man's mystic dimension, and of course familiarity with the Eastern traditions. So imperative lights and movements. We have these. Something comes, a revelation and an impulse to express. If we withhold, if we do not respond, it passes. And afterwards you try to catch it, pull it back, nothing comes. Because it was given, when you didn't take, either it went somewhere else or it was lost, dissipated. But these things are again signs of the instincts of the stuff of supermind. Then, inherent self-effectivities of will. So spontaneously, there is a will which acts precisely, exactly. But it can be concealed in a mental form, and so we do not know. All of us would have had sometimes these spontaneous movements of the body doing exactly what is needed. And when it happens, even you are surprised because you didn't consciously attempt or do it. Kapali Shastriya noted how, because the intuitive consciousness had settled not only in his mind, but had moved into the physical consciousness, into the body and the nerves, that the hands could do things precisely by the intuition, effortlessly. One of the work given to him was in the construction department in the paints section, where he had to mix colors. And so the proportions had to be measured out exactly to get the correct shade. And he notes how his hand would scoop up exactly the amount and pour it. It would match exactly the requirement and the work would simply proceed. And so when we find these kinds of spontaneities, you are making, let's say, you expect a certain number of guests on a special occasion of a birthday, but you're not too sure how many. You've made a certain number of sweets to gift to them, and as it turns out, the last guest comes at 9 p.m. and you give to him the last sweet, and everything is over with the precision of one person even. And you say, this was exact. What was the knowledge? What was the thing which acted to make exactly this movement? A more extreme but rare case is one I recall when I was working on the computer in the early days of computers. It would be in 1988 perhaps, when computers were still a rarity, personal computers, and I was doing a lot of things. It required skill, very specific knowledge. I was using a software which had a certain series of commands in order to copy a part of the text. You had to mark it, you had to press three keys, Control K B, and then end with Control K E, Control K C to copy, and so on. So you had to know all these commands, which pretty much you would develop because you were using them all the time. And then I had read in a magazine a command which was never listed in the manual, and a command which allowed you to cut a vertical block. I used it once and then I forgot about it. 3 years later, maybe 4 years later, I needed to do that, and for the life of me, I couldn't remember what the command was. I tried everything possible, all combinations which could make sense, nothing worked. And then I waited, and for some reason, the mind just became blank. And suddenly the fingers moved. There were 4 keys to press in sequence. They went tick, 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 and the thing was done. And I was surprised. I looked at my fingers because I didn't know what they had done. I don't know which keys they had pressed, but they knew it and they did it. And then I had to try to figure out from the memory of the movement what the keys were, and I think I recovered it finally. But something happened where a very specific knowledge involving 4 different keys on the keyboard in sequence, it happened spontaneously. But this is the kind of expression that's possible. It happens to us at odd moments, we can never repeat them. But that impulse existing deep within the mind is the sign of the supermind's instinct. Unrefined, undeveloped, unorganized, concealed behind activities of the mind. So we read the text again. Mind too is instinct with the stuff of supermind. Sympathies, unities, intuitions, emergences of pre-existent knowledge, instincts, imperative lights and movements, inherent self-effectivities of will, which disguise themselves in a mental form. But the visible principle of supermind can only emerge when the necessary mental conditions are prepared, which will permit it to organize itself in man, the mental living creature. So, the next paragraph describes how these preparations emerge and how they form, which we will take up next Sunday. I thought briefly to read out from a few lines of this poem Kubla Khan, so you get a feel of what was captured in this poem. I will read perhaps the first few lines and you will get the rhythm of the movement, and then skip to the last few, which was the last that he could recall. It begins like this. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alf the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground with walls and towers were girdled round, and there were gardens bright with sinuous rills where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree, and here were forests ancient as the hills, enfolding sunny spots of greenery. But oh, the deep romantic chasm which slanted down the green hill athwart a cedarn cover, a savage place, as holy and enchanted as ever beneath a waning moon was haunted by woman wailing for her demon lover. And from this chasm, with ceaseless turmoil seething, as if this earth in fast thick plants were breathing, a mighty fountain momently was forced, amid whose swift, half-intermittent bursts, huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail, or chaffy grain beneath the thresher's flail. And mid these dancing rocks at once and ever, it flung up momentarily the sacred river. And so it continues like this. You can feel a whole mystic experience. But the last few lines are quite amazing. To such a deep delight 'twould win me, that with music loud and long I would build that dome in air, that sunny dome, those caves of ice, and all who heard would see them there, and all should cry, beware, beware. His flashing eyes, his floating hair, weave a circle round him thrice, and close your eyes with holy dread. For he on honey, for he on honey dew hath fed, and drunk the milk of paradise. So, on this theme of something forming in us, we remind ourselves that not only we can participate, but it has its own will, it has its own action working to emerge from our minds. And Sri Aurobindo, as he worked with the sadhaks around him, continues to act to help form in us and organize this supermind that is slowly emerging from the human mind.